The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic rhythm under the blistering July sun of 1973. It was a rhythm of hope and finality, a song that turned one man's failure into another man's opportunity. I stood near the back, the dust from the parking lot coating my worn leather boots, my arms crossed over a sweat-stained chambray shirt. This was the Henderson place going under the hammer. A good family, but they'd tried to expand too fast, bought a new International Harvester 1066 on credit when the corn price was high, and then a wet spring had drowned half their crop. The bank didn't care about the weather. My neighbor, Richard Miller, or Rich as he insisted everyone call him now, was up front, bidding with a casual flick of his finger. He'd already snapped up a newer disc and a gravity wagon, adding them to his ever-growing fleet. His own father, Old Man Miller, was a good farmer, cautious and steady, much like my own dad had been. But Rich was different. He was part of the new breed, the ones who talked about leverage and cash flow, who saw the farm not as a birthright, but as a portfolio. He drove a brand new John Deere 4630, the one with the sound guard body, air conditioning, and a tape deck. He'd park it by the co-op just to let the diesel idle, the picture of modern agricultural success. I wasn't there for the prime equipment. My eye was on something else, something most men had walked past with a chuckle or a shake of their head. It sat at the far end of the equipment line, looking less like a tractor and more like a monument to a forgotten war. It was massive, articulated in the middle like a giant earth mover, with 8 enormous tires that were cracked and weathered but still held air. The paint, what was left of it, was a faded industrial yellow peeling away to reveal acres of surface rust. The cab was a crude box of steel and glass, and from the engine compartment leaked a dark rainbow of old oil and diesel. A hand-painted name was barely visible on the grime-caked hood: Big Bud. It wasn't one of the production models you'd see in the magazines. This was one of the early ones, a custom job from the Wagner factory in Havre, Montana, before they even started the official line. Henderson had bought it from a big outfit out west that was upgrading, thinking its raw power would let him farm the world. It had a Detroit diesel engine, you could tell by the shape of the valve covers and the sheer size of the twin exhaust stacks that rose up like smokestacks on a battleship. It was a 2-stroke beast, an 8V71 they called the Buzzin' Dozen for its distinctive high-pitched scream. It was raw, ugly, and probably hadn't run in a year. Rich Miller swaggered over, a smirk playing on his lips. He kicked one of the giant tires, which came up to his chest. "Looking at the dinosaur, Jed? Gonna put it in a museum?" I just grunted, running my hand over the cold, pitted steel of the frame. It was 1/4-inch plate, welded by men who knew their business. The bones were good. "You'd be wasting your money," he continued, pulling a pack of Marlboros from his shirt pocket. "Thing's a relic. Parts are impossible to find, probably drinks a gallon of diesel just to turn over. You should be looking at that 4430 over there. Clean, low hours. A man could get a loan for that, write off the depreciation. It's smart business." Smart business. That was Rich's favorite phrase. To him, smart business meant a constant churning cycle of debt and expansion. My father, before he passed last winter, had a different definition. "If you can't pay cash for it, you can't afford it," he'd say, his voice rough as a cob. He'd left me the farm free and clear, 160 acres of the best black dirt in the county, along with a shed full of old but meticulously maintained equipment. A Farmall M he'd bought new after the war, a John Deere 720 diesel that was his pride and joy, and a whole collection of plows, planters, and cultivators that had been paid for in sweat, not interest. The auctioneer was moving down the line. "All right, folks, what have we got here? A big one, a custom job. We're selling it as is, where is. Don't know if she runs, don't have the keys. What do we bid for this yard art?" A few chuckles went through the crowd. Someone yelled out, "I'll give you $50 for scrap." The auctioneer laughed. $50. I got 50. Do I hear 100? $100 for a piece of history, folks. Rich took a long drag from his cigarette and blew the smoke out in a derisive cloud. "Scrap is about right." He clapped me on the shoulder. "Don't do it, Jed. You'll be the laughingstock of the county." He then turned and walked back toward the main action, ready to bid on something shiny and green. I watched him go, laughingstock. Maybe. But I saw something else. I saw a simple, overbuilt machine. No complex hydraulics, no fancy electronics, just raw steel and diesel power. The Detroit engine, if it was sound, was legendary. You could rebuild one on the back of a pickup truck if you had to. The transmission and axles were probably from a scraper or a loader, designed to move mountains, not just pull a plow. It was built for a different kind of farming, a different kind of man. The bidding had stalled at $200. The auctioneer was getting impatient. $200, selling for scrap, going once, going twice. I raised my hand. My voice came out quiet, but clear in the sudden lull. 500. Heads turned. Rich Miller looked back over his shoulder, a look of pure disbelief on his face. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. $500 from Jedediah Stone. Now we got an auction. Do I hear 600? A scrapper from the next town over raised his paddle. 600. 750, I said, my voice firmer this time. My heart was starting to pound. This was more than I'd planned on, but I could feel it in my gut. 800, the scrapper countered. 1,000, I said. The words hung in the hot, still air. That was the last of the cash I had in my pocket from selling a few feeder calves. The crowd was dead silent now. Rich was just staring, his cigarette forgotten between his fingers. The scrapper shook his head and dropped his hand. $1,000, the auctioneer boomed. Sold. To the man with the vision, Jed Stone, for $1,000. The sound of the gavel felt like a starter's pistol. A wave of murmurs rippled through the farmers. I heard someone mutter, "Stone's lost his mind." Rich just shook his head slowly, a pitying smile on his face, and turned his back. I walked up to the clerk's table, counted out the worn bills, and got the receipt. It was mine, a 10-ton pile of rust and problems, but it was all mine. No note at the bank, no lien, no interest payments. Just a title, free and clear. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. Standing there in my boots, with the laughter and the whispers at your back, what would you have done? Would you have listened to reason, to the smart business talk from a guy like Rich, and gone for the shiny new tractor with a bank loan? Or would you have bet it all on that old, ugly, paid-for piece of American iron? Let me know in the comments down below what kind of farmer you'd be. Because the choice I made that day set the course for everything that was to come. Getting the big bud home was a bigger chore than buying it. It was too wide to haul on any normal trailer. I ended up having to pay a heavy equipment hauler with a lowboy, which cost me another $200 I had to borrow from the emergency fund my wife Sarah kept in a coffee can. The look on her face when that monster came rumbling up our lane, shaking the very ground, was a mixture of awe and terror. "Jedediah Stone, what in God's name is that?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she came out of the house. "That, my love, is our future," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The future, for the next 6 months, smelled of penetrating oil, diesel fuel, and burnt coffee. I parked the tractor behind the machine shed, where it dwarfed my little Farmall M like a whale next to a minnow. The first order of business was to see if the engine would even turn. The batteries were long dead, each one the size of a small suitcase. I hauled them out and took them to the co-op for core credit, then spent $100 on 2 new ones. With the new batteries hooked up with heavy-gauge logging cables, I climbed into the cab. The seat was torn, the foam guts spilling out. The gauges were all clouded over. There was no key, just a toggle switch for the power and a push button for the starter. I took a deep breath, flipped the switch, and pushed the button. Nothing. Not a click, not a groan. Just dead silence. My heart sank. $1,000 for a lawn ornament. But I wasn't my father's son for nothing. He'd taught me to be methodical. I spent the next week tracing wires. The wiring harness was a rat's nest of cracked insulation and corroded connections. I tore it all out, every last wire, and started from scratch. Using a simple wiring diagram, I drew myself on a piece of cardboard. Power from the battery to the starter solenoid, a wire to the fuel shutoff, another to the gauges. Simple. While I worked, the talk at the grain elevator and the feed store was all about Jed's folly. Rich Miller would be holding court, leaning against his shiny new pickup. "Poor Jed," I heard he'd said one afternoon. His dad worked his whole life to build that place up, and he's gonna run it into the ground with junk. He's trying to farm in the 70s with 30s era thinking. The word stung, mostly because there was a kernel of fear in me that he was right. Every night I'd come in, my hands stained black with grease that no soap could touch, my back aching, and Sarah would have a hot meal waiting. She never once said I'd made a mistake, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The farm was her home too. Her whole life was tied up in those 160 acres just as much as mine was. After rewiring the starter circuit, I tried again. This time, when I hit the button, the big Delco Remy starter engaged with a loud clunk and a groan. The massive engine turned over, slow and protesting, like an old man getting out of bed. Whoom, whoom, whoom. It wouldn't fire, but it was turning. It was alive. The next step was fuel. The tanks were full of a brown, sludgy mess that smelled like varnish. I spent 2 days draining the twin 100-gallon tanks, flushing them with clean diesel, and then I moved on to the fuel system. The Detroit 8V71 had 2 massive canister fuel filters. When I unscrewed them, a thick, algae-like slime oozed out. I replaced them, bled the lines all the way up to the injectors, and filled the new filters with fresh fuel. I climbed back into the cab. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the farmyard. My muscles ached. I was tired down to the bone. This was the moment of truth. I flipped the power switch, took a deep breath, and hit the starter button. The engine turned, whoom, whoom. Then one cylinder caught with a cough of black smoke. Chug, then another, chug-chug. The pace quickened. The slow groaning turned into a ragged, loping rhythm. More black smoke poured from the twin stacks, blotting out the evening sky. And then, with a final shuddering roar, the big Detroit caught on all 8 cylinders. It wasn't a rumble like my John Deere diesel. It was a scream, a high-pitched, angry 2-stroke howl that rattled the windows in the house. It settled into a loping, crackling idle that sounded like nothing else on earth. I sat there for a full minute, my hand on the throttle lever, feeling the vibration thrum through the steel floor plates into the soles of my boots. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Sarah came running out of the house, a dish towel in her hand, a huge smile spreading across her face. I killed the engine and the sudden silence was deafening. I climbed down, my legs shaky. "It runs," she said, her voice full of relief. "It runs," I repeated, a grin splitting my own grimy face. I had a long way to go. The transmission fluid needed changing, the hydraulics were weak, and I still needed to fabricate a drawbar that could handle the power. But the heart of the beast was beating. My $1,000 gamble was alive. The early 1970s were a golden age for farmers who were willing to take a risk. In 1972, the Soviet Union, facing a disastrous harvest, secretly bought nearly a quarter of the United States wheat crop. The deal, which became known as the Great Grain Robbery, sent commodity prices into the stratosphere overnight. Corn went from $1 a bushel to $3. Soybeans doubled. Suddenly, farming wasn't just a way of life, it was a gold rush. Land values shot up. A farmer could use his newly valuable land as collateral to borrow more money from the bank to buy more land, which was also skyrocketing in value. The bankers, the equipment dealers, and the government were all singing the same tune, "Get big or get out." The Secretary of Agriculture himself, Earl Butz, was telling farmers to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Rich Miller was the poster boy for this new era. He used his father's farm as leverage to buy the 200 acres of the old Henderson place. He traded in his year-old 4630 for a brand-new John Deere 8630, an articulated 4-wheel drive that was the pinnacle of modern technology. It had a 6-cylinder, 619 cubic inch turbocharged and intercooled engine, a 16-speed quad-range transmission, and a cab so quiet you could listen to the radio while you worked. It was a beautiful, powerful, and astronomically expensive machine. He drove it over to my place one fall afternoon. I was out in the yard, welding up a new, heavier drawbar for the big Bud, using half-inch steel plate I'd bought at the scrapyard. The Bud was idling nearby, its distinctive 2-stroke cackle echoing off the machine shed. Rich killed the engine on his Deere and stepped down from the climate-controlled cab, looking clean and comfortable in a fresh polo shirt. He gestured toward my tractor with his chin. Still messing with that relic, I see. She's coming along, I said, flipping up my welding mask. Sweat was pouring down my face. Jed, I don't get you, he said, shaking his head. Look around. The world is changing. A guy can make a fortune right now. I just locked in a contract for $3 corn on 500 acres. I'm going to clear more this year than my dad made in the last 10 combined. And you're here, patching up junk. This junk doesn't have a payment book, I replied, striking another arc with my welder. You gotta spend money to make money, he said, his voice rising with evangelical fervor. Debt is a tool, Jed. You use the bank's money to expand your operation. It's simple economics. What happens when corn goes back to $1.50? I asked over the sizzle of the weld. He laughed. It's never going back. This is the new normal, global demand. The world needs American farmers. We can't lose. He stayed for a few more minutes, bragging about the new grain dryer he was having installed and the vacation to Florida he was planning for the winter. To him, I was a hopeless case, a man stuck in the past, too stubborn or too scared to seize the opportunity in front of him. When he left, the quiet hum of his high-tech Deere was a stark contrast to the raw, mechanical roar of my big Bud. That fall, I put the Bud to the test. I hooked it up to a 24-foot chisel plow I'd bought at another auction. My old John Deere 720 could barely pull a 10-foot plow in our heavy soil. The big Bud didn't even know it was back there. I put it in gear, throttled up, and that Detroit diesel screamed its song of power. The ground ripped open behind me. I could cover my 160 acres in a day and a half, a job that used to take me the better part of a week. The tractor was crude, the steering was sloppy, the cab was loud and drafty, and it rode like a buckboard wagon. But it did the work. It did the work of 3 smaller tractors, sipping less fuel per acre than Rich's brand new Deere because it was working so efficiently. While Rich was farming more acres, he was also spending more. More on fuel for his big new machines, more on fertilizer to push for higher yields, more on high-interest operating loans to cover his massive inputs. He was living high on the hog, but his margins were thinner than he realized. I, on the other hand, stuck to my father's plan. I farmed my 160 acres. The high grain prices were a blessing, but I didn't see them as a new normal. I saw them as a window, a chance to get ahead. I took the extra profit from that year's crop, and instead of buying a new pickup or taking a vacation, I paid off the small operating loan I'd taken for seed. I bought a new welder. I put a new steel roof on the barn. I invested in the farm, not in the illusion of wealth. The neighbors still thought I was crazy. They saw Rich Miller with all his new land and new iron, and they saw me with my patched-up monster of a tractor. I was the fool who was missing the boat, the man who brought a knife to a gunfight. They didn't see that my knife was paid for. One evening in the late fall of '74, I was at the co-op settling my account. The manager, a weary-looking man named Frank, was looking over some papers on his desk. "Interest rates are going up again, Jed," he said, not looking at me. "The Fed is trying to get a handle on this inflation." "Is that so?" I said, signing my check. "Yeah," he sighed. "Gonna make these operating loans a lot more expensive next spring. Got some guys in here, they're leveraged to the hilt. A guy like Rich Miller, he's borrowing hundreds of thousands of dollars. A 1% jump in the prime rate is going to cost him a fortune." Frank shook his head. "These good times feel nice, but they don't last forever. I just hope these boys know what they're doing." I walked out into the cool night air and looked up at the stars. A storm was coming, not a storm of wind and rain, but one of numbers on a ledger and decisions made in faraway cities. I didn't know when it would hit or how bad it would be. But as I drove home, I thought of my machine shed. Inside sat the big Bud, ugly and loud, but owned. Bought and paid for with cash. Whatever was coming, I'd face it with my own iron, not the bank's. The late '70s were a fever dream. The price of corn flirted with $4, and farmland in our county was selling for prices that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. It seemed Rich Miller's gospel of debt and expansion was the one true faith. He bought another 80 acres bordering his new ground, financing it with a variable rate loan that made the old-timers suck air through their teeth. He built a new machine shed, a gleaming palace of steel that made my wooden barn look like a relic from the Great Depression. His operation was the talk of the coffee shop, a shining example of the new American agriculture. I held my course. I kept my 160 acres. The Big Bud and I were a familiar, if eccentric, sight. I'd spent a winter overhauling the massive Clark planetary axles and rebuilding the hydraulic cylinders. I found a man in Iowa who had a yard full of old construction equipment and bought a spare Allison transmission for $500, just in case. I was building resilience, not an empire. My neighbors saw a man hoarding junk. I saw a man stockpiling independence. The first tremor came not from the market, but from the sky. The summer of 1980 was a biblical trial. The sun rose each morning not as a golden promise, but as a brassy, malevolent eye in a hazy white sky. The heat settled over the cornfields like a physical weight, pressing the life out of the leaves until they curled in on themselves, a brittle, silvery green. The rain simply stopped. Day after day, the forecast was the same, hot and dry. The ground cracked open in fissures wide enough to swallow a wrench. My corn tasseled early, stunted and desperate. The ears that formed were small, the kernels scattered and undeveloped. It was a disaster, but a universal one. Everyone's crop was burning up. The real difference was in the machinery. In the blistering heat of July, my Big Bud, with its oversized cooling system designed for moving mountains in the desert, just kept running. The Detroit screamed its defiant song, and the cab, with its 2 small fans I'd installed, was an oven, but the temperature gauge never moved past 190. One afternoon, I saw Rich's magnificent John Deere 8630 sitting silent in the middle of his field, the big field cultivator behind it half buried in the dust. I drove my pickup down his lane. Rich was sitting on the ground in the sliver of shade cast by a giant tire, his head in his hands. "Trouble?" I asked. He looked up, and I was startled by the look in his eyes. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a raw, hunted fear. "The transmission," he said, his voice hoarse, "just quit. Made a sound like a coffee can full of bolts, and that was it. Won't go into gear." "That's a quad range, isn't it?" I asked. "Yeah," he spat. 16 speeds of uselessness. The dealer sent a kid out. He hooked up some gauges, scratched his head, and said they'd have to split the tractor to get to it. Said it'd be $10,000, maybe more, and they can't even get to it for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Jed. This crop is dying by the hour. I didn't have any words of comfort that wouldn't sound hollow. He was helpless. His state-of-the-art machine, with its complex planetary gear sets and hydraulic clutch packs, was beyond his ability to repair. He was completely dependent on the dealership, on their schedule and their prices. A week later, my own tractor quit. I was halfway through a pass when the engine sputtered and died. The silence that followed was terrifying. But I climbed down, my heart pounding a steady, methodical rhythm. I knew the machine. I checked for fuel. The gauge, one of the few that worked, said half full. I cracked an injector line, no fuel. I traced it back. The electric fuel pump wasn't humming. I put a test light on the wire leading to it. No power. I followed the wire back into the cab, a single, thick wire I'd installed myself. It had chafed against a steel bracket, the insulation worn through and shorted out. 15 minutes with a roll of electrical tape and a new piece of wire, and the Detroit roared back to life. The cost of the repair was about 3 cents. The drought broke in late August with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what was left of the corn. The harvest was a grim, depressing affair. Yields were less than half of normal. That was the second blow. The third, and most deadly, came from Washington. To punish the Soviet Union for invading Afghanistan, the president had declared a grain embargo. Our biggest customer was gone overnight. The price of corn, which had held strong in the face of the drought, collapsed. The golden age was over. The music had stopped. And men like Rich Miller were left standing without a chair, holding millions of dollars in variable rate loans. The new decade began with a plague of numbers. The Federal Reserve, desperate to kill the runaway inflation of the 70s, cranked interest rates to levels nobody had ever seen. The prime rate, the number the banks based their loans on, climbed past 15%, then 18%. In 1981, it peaked at 21.5%. For the farmers who had bet the farm on the gospel of get big or get out, it was a death sentence. Their variable rate loans, the ones they'd signed when the rate was 8%, were now ticking time bombs of financial ruin. The talk at the co-op was no longer about yields and new equipment. It was hushed, fearful whispers about who had gotten a notice from the bank, who was having a farm sale. The bulletin board, once covered in ads for seed corn and feeder pigs, was now plastered with auction flyers. Good families, families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years, were being wiped out. It was a quiet, brutal war fought with calculators and foreclosure notices. I saw Rich at the bank one Tuesday morning. He was coming out of the manager's office as I was going in. He looked like a ghost. His face was gaunt, his eyes were hollow, and he'd lost so much weight his clothes seemed to hang off him. He didn't meet my gaze. He just stared at the floor and walked past me, a man already defeated. I was there to see about a small loan to build a new grain bin. My old wooden one was starting to fail. The loan officer, a young man who always seemed nervous, looked at my paperwork. He saw my assets, 160 acres of land, owned outright. A fleet of older, paid-for machinery. He saw my liabilities, 0. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a kind of disbelief. "Mr. Stone," he said, you're in the black, completely. I haven't seen a balance sheet like this in 2 years. He approved the loan on the spot at a fixed rate. I was a relic, an anomaly in a world of leverage and ruin. My survival wasn't glorious, it was grim. Corn prices were so low that even with my rock-bottom costs, I was barely breaking even. But I wasn't going backward. I wasn't lying awake at night listening to the wind and wondering if the next letter in the mailbox would be from the bank's attorney. Sarah and I cut back. We grew a bigger garden, canned everything we could. We didn't have much cash, but we were secure. We owned our land. We owned our iron. The big bud sat in the shed, a hulking yellow guarantee that come spring, I could put a crop in the ground, beholden to no one. The inevitable news about Rich came in the spring of '82. An auction flyer appeared on the co-op board. Complete dispersal, it read. Richard Miller Farms. The list of equipment was long and impressive. The John Deere 8630, a nearly new 8820 combine, a full line of late-model tillage equipment and planters, and 380 acres of prime farmland, including his father's original homestead. Everything was going under the hammer. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a miserable March wind whipping across the muddy farmyard. The crowd was different from the one at the Henderson sale years before. There were no hopeful young farmers looking for a start. It was mostly older, grim-faced men and a pack of predatory-looking investors from the city. The atmosphere wasn't one of opportunity, it was a funeral. Rich was standing by the fuel tanks, staring off into the distance. He looked 10 years older. His father, Old Man Miller, was beside him, his face a mask of stone, watching the farm he had spent his life building be dismantled piece by piece. I walked over, not knowing what to say. "Jed," Rich said, his voice a dry rasp. He finally looked at me. "You were right. God help me, you were right all along." There was no triumph in his words, no satisfaction for me. I just saw a good man who had believed the experts, who had played the game by their rules and lost everything. "I'm sorry, Rich," was all I could manage. The auctioneer started. The bidding was slow, pathetic. The machinery, which had cost a fortune just a few years before, was selling for pennies on the dollar. The market was flooded with used equipment from 1,000 other farm sales just like this one. There were no buyers. Then they came to the 8630, Rich's pride and joy, the symbol of the new era. The auctioneer tried to start the bidding at $20,000. He was met with dead silence. He dropped it to 15. Nothing. 10, a lone bid came from one of the investors. I thought of Rich's words, "You gotta spend money to make money." I thought of his pitying smile when I bought the big bud. But mostly I thought of his father, standing there watching his son's world crumble. I raised my hand. 12,000, I said. The investor countered. I went to 13. We went back and forth, but his heart wasn't in it. He dropped out at 14.5. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his voice echoing in the cold air. "To Jedediah Stone," the crowd murmured. I had just bought the most advanced tractor in the county for less than a new pickup truck. I owned both the past and the future of farming, and both were paid for. The auction was a blur of sorrow and grim necessity. When the final gavel fell, Rich Miller no longer owned a single acre of the land his family had worked for generations. He was a tenant on the earth, stripped bare by a storm of bad advice and worse luck. The investors from the city had bought most of the land, planning to rent it out to the highest bidder. I had managed to buy the 80 acres that bordered my own farm, the piece with the good waterway and the stand of oaks on the hill. I paid cash, using the money I had carefully saved during the good years, the money I hadn't spent on shiny new things. A week later, I was in my shop, going over the John Deere 8630. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, but needlessly complex. I found the problem in the transmission. A 50-cent snap ring had failed, allowing a shaft to shift and chew up a $10,000 planetary gear set. It was a perfect metaphor for the whole crisis. A system so intricate that one tiny failure could cause total collapse. There was a knock on the shop door. It was Rich. He stood there, twisting a worn cap in his hands, unable to meet my eyes. "Jed," he started, I don't know what I'm going to do. My dad and I were moving into town. Got a little rental house. I've been looking for work, but..." His voice trailed off. What was a farmer with no farm? I wiped my hands on a rag and looked him straight in the eye. "I've got 240 acres now, Rich. That's more than I can handle by myself, not properly. And this thing," I said, patting the huge fender of the 8630, "is too complicated for a simple man like me. I need someone who knows how to run it. I need a good man." He looked up, confusion and then a glimmer of hope dawning in his tired eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'll pay you a good wage, and I'll rent you your dad's original 80 acres back, the homestead, for a share of the crop. You can farm it with my equipment until you get back on your feet. It's a start." Tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to speak but couldn't. He just nodded, a wave of relief so profound it seemed to physically steady him. It wasn't charity. It was good sense. He was one of the best farmers I knew, and I needed the help. More than that, it was the right thing to do. My father had taught me that you measure a man not by what he accumulates, but by his name in the community. On that day, the name Jedediah Stone was good. The rest of the 80s were a slow, painful recovery. The community had been hollowed out, but the ones who survived, the ones who had been cautious and lucky, grew stronger. Rich worked for me for 5 years. He was a changed man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility and a fierce work ethic. He saved every penny. He farmed his 80 acres like they were the most precious garden on earth. Eventually, he saved enough for a down payment and bought the homestead back from the investment company that had held the note. The day he signed the papers, he came to my house with a bottle of whiskey, and we sat on the porch and watched the sun go down, 2 farmers who had been to the brink and back. Years rolled by. My son, Daniel, grew from a boy into a young man with my height and his mother's steady eyes. He spent his summers in the shop with me, learning the difference between a box-end wrench and a socket. I taught him how to weld, how to time an engine, how to read the land. One warm evening in the late 90s, we were in the machine shed. The big Bud sat in the corner, retired from frontline duty, but still started up every few months. Its yellow paint was faded, its tires were cracked with age, but it had an aura of quiet dignity, like a retired champion. Daniel, now 17, was running a grease gun, methodically working his way through the Zerk fittings on the articulated joint. "Dad," he asked, his voice echoing slightly in the big shed, "why do you keep this old thing?" "The 8630 is a better tractor. It's got air conditioning." I smiled and walked over, placing my hand on the massive, rust-pitted hood. The steel was cool under my palm. "This tractor," I said, "is a lesson. It looks ugly. It's loud. It's uncomfortable. But your grandpa taught me that there's a difference between looking rich and being sound. In the 70s, everyone wanted the new, shiny tractors. They borrowed a fortune to buy them. They looked rich, but they weren't sound. Their whole lives were owned by the bank." I pointed to the huge Detroit engine. "This machine is simple. It's overbuilt. It's honest. When it breaks, you and I can fix it right here with our own 2 hands. And most important, it's paid for. It never sent us a bill. It never charged us interest." I looked at my son, hoping he could understand the depth of what I was saying. This tractor is the reason we're still standing here, on our own land. It's not just steel and diesel, son. It's freedom. Never forget that. Never trade what is real and paid for something that just looks good on paper. He looked from the old tractor back to me, and for the first time, I saw him looking at the big bud not as a piece of junk, but as the guardian of our family's legacy. He nodded slowly, a deep understanding passing between us without any more words. I looked out the big open door of the shed. The sun was setting over my fields, the same fields my father had worked, the same fields my son would one day work. The land was still here, we were still here, and in the fading light, the old, ugly, beautiful tractor stood silent watch, a monument to a simple truth learned the hard way, that the strongest things on this earth are not always the newest or the shiniest, but the ones built to last free and clear.